Hi, and welcome to another side quest of Menu Combat. I've been so excited to return to you all with some new content, and I'm specifically going to be talking about this game here in my background in case some of you are watching elsewhere of Persona 5. So, I was going to try to wait till I finish the Royal content, but I'm going to place it like this. I've enjoyed the Royal content from the little bit I've gotten to experience so far, but my original intent was to end at the core five story, and then decide later on where I wanted to do Royal content. And there are a lot of thoughts that I've been having that I think this deserved a side quest before the next real season kicks in. And the thing that's been on my mind, right? I have had conversations with peers about this game, but I've been trying to be careful about how much I divulge. The thing that I want to say most about Persona 5, this is a game of endurance. And I don't just mean what we normally say when we say this. So obviously, I've heard so much about Persona 5 going into this game, but the thing that people always talk about is like, this is a long game. And they're right. It is extremely long. It is a tale of endurance in terms to finish the content and to know that I've 80 hours in, core game done, and I have royal content left. Oh my gosh, there's more. But that's not what I mean. The dungeon crawling, like the substantial gameplay part of this game, is a tale of endurance, and the entire game is built around that idea. And I feel like that's something that's just not conveyed the way that I think it should have. What do I mean? Especially in the early, probably first four, even maybe five, I'll say four dungeons, you have to conserve and manage your SP. And it is such a different way to conceive how dungeons are both laid out, how you make decisions. And maybe it's because I don't play much dungeon crawls. Like, I don't have an Etrian Odyssey background. I've only played parts of SMT3 up until Oze. And so I don't have, when I conceive dungeons, I'm thinking Golden Sun, even some Zelda, some Tales. Those are where my head goes. And this doesn't operate or function like those dungeons. You see, in those dungeons, you end up in a save point. You usually have something to replenish your health. When you get to a point that replenishes your health, you're like, okay, now I have the actual core issues to sort out. Okay, I have the next major boss battle because they're trying to replenish your energy, so you have this. Every time you find a save room in Persona 5 Royal, they're not giving you nothing back. And unless you develop certain relationships, which we'll talk about soon, you don't really get a benefit to the save rooms, rather that besides to say, I got this far in the dungeon. And I feel like that's what this is. It's like, I got this far in the dungeon, let me mark that. Like, literally, whenever you end a day in a dungeon, what does it tell you? Found the will seed, found a save room, found a boss. That's it. It, like, checkers that. And so this game is telling you, you will not, especially for the first four dungeons, knock out a dungeon in a day or two or even three until you start developing the development of your SP. And that's the thing that I had to meditate on, is that this game uses obviously the weakness system of one more, where if you exploit a weakness, you get an additional turn. You can baton pass, or I think they just call it baton. I know I'm using my Pokemon language, but you baton pass power-ups to exploit more weaknesses and things of that nature. It's a really nice cycle of a gameplay loop. But in order to deal with most of the actual issues in this game, you will use SP, right? Like, unless you're dealing with one of the core mini bosses where your magic doesn't really have much use, you're going to use your SP to be able to maneuver and get around these dungeons. And so you can never, at least for me, especially like Kamoshida's, Madarame's, like the very first few up until Futaba, I'm just charting out my moment of like, okay, knock this out, get here, knock this out, get here, leave. And I think it makes sense, right? This is a game that has so much social link focus in terms of the relationships you build and how those things can affect dungeon crawling. And so therefore, the game has to feel like a dungeon crawl. Like, it now makes it better, not necessarily in the sense of, I've never obviously played P3 or even P4, but I can understand better why those are procedurally generated dungeons, because it has to be a crawl. It is not about the perfectly designed space. It's supposed to exhaust you. And this is where I say my brain has to adjust about how I perceive this moment, right? Because everything feels this, right? Like your SP usage, as I talked about, the battle system, you are asked to use all of it. And then you need to find ways to replenish or get to a save room to use the SP kits. And you talking about using so many, either the stuff through Sojo with coffee or the stuff with Te Takemi to get to use the SP kits. If you develop those relationships, you get things cheaper or more. It's really all combined. And so when I think of these dungeons and I struggle with how like certain things are laid out, I'm asking myself, can I even evaluate this game through that lens of dungeon that I know, especially when the rest of this is built in another way? And I don't know. I fundamentally don't know how I should evaluate these dungeons. But I've had to embrace that Persona 5 is a game, both in terms of obviously the large experience is a long, exhausting experience, but the dungeons are designed to exhaust you and for you to get tired. Like even the game even punishes you when you get lazy in the dungeons. I'm talking about if you get caught and you're just not like being careful anymore. And that can happen because you get exhausted. It's like, all right, I'm ready to get to the next save room. I'm ready. I'm just trying to push further. The alert systems go up. You face more punishing enemies. You can get more ambushes. It's actually like thoughtfully all integrated, but it's exhausting. And I still, to this day, don't know if I like it. But I have to respect the way that the secondary part of the game feeds this, which is, as you continue to play Persona 5, the ease of dungeon crawling evolves. And they evolve because of your relationships that you build with your characters. So I have tried to conceive of like, how do social links work, right? Like before I played a game like this, and I realized it's very Harvest Moon-y, right? Like if you come from anything like Harvest Moon, Story of Seasons, I know technically they're the same. You know what the difference is now. Things from that family tree, you get a better sense of what it means to deepen relationships. But I didn't understand how it worked of a day, and so my brain is wrapping my head around. You usually get like 20 odd days per dungeon, and in between that time, you're juggling several different things at the same time. You're first juggling the fact that you got 21 days to go through this dungeon, and we've just talked about how much of an endurance test this is. But to make your dungeon experience better, there are a couple of things you want to consider. One, are you making enough money to go either to the weapon shop or the item shop? Are you wanting to develop your relationships with your peers, right? Either be Ryuji, An, Makoto, whoever, to make your battles go quicker. And I mean that in the sense of if you get exploited with a, a status thing, if you develop enough a long relationship, they'll knock you out. Or even thinking about the fact that sometimes they'll join in on certain attacks to do a critical attack for you. Things of that nature. And seeing that, okay, so those are all evolving dungeon things. And then some of the non-NPC characters, we're talking people like Kawami or even Yoshizawa, although we know that story in the royal content, they start changing your entire rhythm around dungeon crawling, right? So with Yoshizawa, you get the nice grappling hook, which changes the way that you can ambush in dungeons, which makes that a better experience. Or if you're doing stuff with Kawami, the teacher, you are getting the wonderful stuff of, hey, if you use her at night to massage, you get more things to do in the evening. Like, or if you develop stuff with Mishima gives you bonus XP. Like, everything, all these people, as you develop your relationships, as you spend time, but is a limited resource, they all make dungeon crawling better. And you can't put a premium on that. That's a beautiful feeling. And so you are compelled, right? Like, we're going to get to the story stuff there, but if you're compelled to make dungeon crawling a easier experience, a more satisfying experience, you are compelled through the relationships you build with other characters to make those moments more easier. And so when we talk about, hey, the dungeon crawling gets easier, it's because you develop relationships with more characters, right? Like, I invested in Takemi first, who's the one who's in charge of the nursing place, just so I can get access to more healing stuff, just so I could actually have that. And that's not necessarily the most strategic answer here, but it is one of those of, hey, this game will ask, if you spend time, right? Like, and this is the key thing, is that either you go to a dungeon or you spend time, right? Like, you're left with that choice of, is today a dungeon run, or is this a day where I want to develop relationships with other people? And if I do the relationship with other people, that'll make a future dungeon run easier. That's great. And so you have this time management element to Persona 5 where you're like, all right, can I risk a day like this? Can I risk a day like this? And then what's beautiful, right, is that this game, when it's in its bag, because it's not always in its bag, let's be clear, if the story elements around these characters compel you enough, you start making choices that have nothing to do with the ease of dungeon crawling and all about, but you wanted to spend more time with these characters. I think that has been the question for me about how good are these stories with these supporting characters that I am like, you know what, I want to always make that decision. I think what was great is whenever they show up more idiosyncratically, right? Like, the moment, I think this was right after summer vacation with Ryuji. The minute that Ryuji says, hey, I am ready for us to go do the stakeout for the new coach of the running team. Everything drops. Like, I no longer operate as like, no, it's like, I want to see the end of Ryuji's story. I need to see how he emotionally comes to this conclusion. Moments like that in this game, I'm talking about even the stuff with Akechi. I'm talking about specifically, I think it's Battle 8. And you're just like, oh, I just want to see where this goes. Or for me, seeing Sojiro wanting to heal that relationship between Sojiro and Futaba, you get so many moments where you're like, you are no longer just thinking of these characters as dungeon pieces or dungeon solution pieces. You're thinking of these characters as, oh, I love these people. I want to see where this goes. I think you struggle with this game when two things come to light. There are 10 ranks, and not all 10 ranks have the same impact. And I think you wrestle with that so much about, sometimes you feel like you wasted time. Sometimes you feel like you didn't get anything from that interaction. I don't really know how I wrestle with that concept. Because as much as I will say, it is good to see the end of Mishima or whatever, you kind of, story beats repeat. Things are elongated, and sometimes you're just there fast forwarding through a moment. And then we don't talk about the other element, right? So I've talked about the dungeon crawling and social links, but in order to really get better with the social links, you have your 5 personality stats you have to develop. And that becomes a grind. And sometimes it could lead to like great individual moments. I've mentioned before on my TikTok about like the learning about different coffees, and seeing Jamaican Blue Mountain coffee represented was an exciting moment. I love that. But every time I wanted to build my kindness and I wasn't at Lala's place, I was doing the cleanup inside of LeBlanc, I fast forward through that. Same thing when you do stuff to build knowledge when you're just studying. Fast forward. And the game has that built in, but I think it indicates to you that time is passing. And I thought about this moment a lot. Persona 5, shout outs to Eric Van Allen from the Axe of Blood podcast, he says it right. It's like Persona 5 says, take your time in the loading screens, and that's like a message in the game. But one of the things I struggle with Persona 5 is that all of these things are sometimes can be interconnected, but they're interconnected in such explicit ways, right? Like they literally tell you, hey, you can't interact with Anne until you get kindness level 2. You can't fix Sojiro's future until you reach level 5 angelic kindness. And there's so many different places. You don't have the guts enough to build the thing with EY. And all of that is cool. But you start sometimes looking at these folks as less as their wonderful story bits, but more as like mechanical gates and keys. And I don't necessarily think that's inherently bad, but it changes your goals in these times, which is why, as I said, I think it makes you want to fast forward through some of the reading you do, fast forward through all these things. So you're like, I'm just trying to get this accomplishment. I'm trying to get to the next social thing. And I don't know how much I like that. I don't know how it's exquisite, and I don't think it's as elegant in terms of the ways that you perceive the relationships and time being spent. At some point in time, I just got tired, and I'm comparing this subliminally to Friends of Ringo Ishikawa, another game that has some social stuff, but a lot of different mechanics about like reading and things passing time and watching him study, watching him this. And I'm thinking about in that game, you don't know what the outcomes of the decisions you make will be. And so when you start to see things develop and change, or even just see like, oh, that dialogue can only exist because I made this decision, it makes you feel like the choice of your time is having like this elegant impact on the wider space. Where I think in this game of Persona 5, the decisions you make are obviously having a wider connection, but it's all very clear and it doesn't feel as elegant. And I think it's one of those questions about how much do you want to give players choice over those decisions, right? In one sense, you could say that the art of a high school era is about managing your time and developing that. But I think sometimes these things become mechanical value rather than like the rehabilitation process, right? Because that's the thing, is like this game talks about this is a rehabilitation process for you, and that is so much about developing the relationships with these people. But sometimes these people become mechanical gates, or the social status to develop those things become just gates and keys rather than feeling like you're deepening relationships because you want to. And that's why if you ask me who the best character in this game is, it goes to Sojiro. Everything with Sojiro is about you becoming a better person, Sojiro identifying that, and you transforming Sojiro and his relationship to Futaba. And I think it tells you the reason why it's so special is that he is a key, and not just a key, but it's like he is integral to the story of the game. He's integral to the key turning point in terms of where the story is about to go because of his connection to Futaba. But it is also about like everything about your social stats become actually like really important. I go back to him where it's like he unlocks so much about the spirit of this game that I think he's the best social link. Without question. And mind you, I haven't done all the social links, but you talk about that. And so I say all of these things to talk about the social stuff and the social stats and the connection of your 5 personality stats. I want to talk about the story here. I don't know if I like the story, and I've been meditating on it. I think the game betrays itself too early that it bothers me. So the game opens with the Kamoshida arc, which I think everyone says is it's a gut punch. It's entirely great. In terms of it, we think that he's scum, we recognize how evil is, and we are exploring his subconscious very well in terms of the things that are placed there. It's really a strong start, and I think particularly both Ryuji and An's relationship to him is so foundational to the spirit of the game, especially Ryuji. Understanding that this game is about the active defiance of adults, it's just such a good beginning. But the rest of it, right? Like ultimately, you have people who are learning to let go of the masks of performance. You have folks who are learning to defy and not just follow the social scripts, right? One of the underlying ideas in Persona is that we apply these social scripts, we put on a mask to align with these social scripts, especially the ones given to teenagers from adults, to not be critical and thoughtful. And now you as a teenager, as you establish your own identity, you're breaking those masks to identify who you're going to be and question the status quo in many ways. But ask yourself, once we leave Kamoshida, does the rest of that stuff really do great? I don't know, right? Like, I definitely think Madarame is a perfect place. But once we leave Madarame, you have Kaneshiro, you have even Sei, and I think Sei is excellent in terms of what she provides for the story overall, but like the spirit and the nature of the game, I think at least Shido sits as a adult trying to control at the highest political level, and how much humans trusting adults in that field is a real question, and you can interrogate that in meaningful ways. And you start getting to the question of social status quo when you start connecting Shido to mementos, right? Where part of it is that why aren't people believing these changes, and how does that say about adults and their perspectives about being trapped, and what does that say about our will to choose, and what do we want as like the nature of society? Like, it can get there, but there's a whole lot of in between stuff where I'm just like, let's cut through this. And I think where I say I use the word Persona 5 betrays its opening is that the Kamoshida stuff is repulsive and it's about this, and then you meet, I keep saying Kawami, please forgive me if that's not the teacher's name, but her, Takemi, the fact that you can have relationships with these two so quickly right after that arc, it doesn't sit well. And I've tried to meditate with that choice of how can you call out everything with Kamoshida but provide these as romantic options for the player. And I don't think the game squares that circle. I think it's trying to have its cake and eat it too. And I think part of it is an acknowledgement that part of the fan base is going to be older, and so we provide older people for that lens. But I just don't know if that works. I really don't. And I also struggle with Ann's treatment right around this moment in the game, right? So part of the thing is that we all identify that the sexual leering of Kamoshida onto Ann is a bad thing, right? Like, the minute she walks on to the cognitive version of Kamoshida in the bikini, we're like, this is bad. We feel awful. But everything with Morgana and Anne just does not sit, and I've meditated on that so much about how much Morgana leers at Anne, and it comes up in the Futaba Palace where all of them do, and her mask ripping off moment is about, to an extent, her embracing her sexuality, and I'm like, wait, what are we doing? And I don't even want to say that that's inherently wrong, particularly when you learn Anne's relationship to being a model, right? And so you can you recontextualize that. It's like, it's not about that, but it is about how she portrays herself and owning that in a meaningful way because of her passion for modeling. I just I struggle with the leering, and I don't know. Y'all tell me how y'all feel. I feel like these things happening so quickly after the Kamoshida arc, the teachers and the adults you can have relationships with, how Anne is treated right after this whole thing of like, adults are doing the wrong thing, places the player in a weird space about these perspectives. And I also understand it's like I'm in a particular place, so maybe I'm just reading it incorrectly. I've had a good conversation about on with a friend of mine, and I understood the perspective better. It's just, eh. Uh, I for those who want to know, I did end up romancing specifically Chihaya. I think she's a great thing about this idea of fate versus will, uh, and the idea of equipping people with the skill sets to will the change. And I think that leads to something that's beautiful. When I beat Persona 5, I thought I was going to get this grand like ending, and then it goes straight into the royal content. And I think it's genius because it's one of those things where it's like, if I did not know this is royal content, I would assume that this is the rest of the game. At the end of Persona 5, you face a god that kind of represents people's relationship with the status quo and not making changes and don't wanting to make decisions for themselves, and therefore relinquishing it to the fullness of social pressures of things around you. And so when it came to the idea of Shiho, people didn't want to give up, not because they didn't recognize that Shiho was evil. It's like, oh my god, this breaks social convention for us to now have to carry the responsibility here and identify them, because that means that we are on the hook for decisions, and we as a society don't always want to be on the hook for decisions. We want the social pressures of people around us to be the guiding force, and that's not inherently wrong, but it is just how society is set up. That is the end of Persona 5, where you are now tasking, especially adults, right? Because Sei keeps on saying, the adults will take it from here. But about asking adults to now make decisions rather than yield to the status quo. Because once we've lifted the veil, what are the decisions you're going to make? There's a bunch of things in which, if you engage in society right now, you can ask what that tension really looks like and apply it. What Maruki's presence does after that is elegant, because it is, hey, let's remove decisions, but specifically, we're going to remove the suffering that you go through that comes from decisions outside of your control, right? Because that's the thing. It is. Think about what everybody is. So after the setup for the royal content is everything is weird. Morgana is a human being now. My boy Fox, I keep forgetting his real name, is now literally gets to have the Sayuri up and being essentially under Madarame again. Or you get what's his name? You get Makoto having her father back in her life. Think about it, these are all traumatic things that they didn't choose. And so what Maruki is like, we can fix that. And wouldn't it be better off this way? He gets to make the choice, but it's a choice that makes everybody happy. Right? Because think about it, the God's choice or the choice in that other thing was like, we're relinquishing making the choice, but it's painful to do so when you really examine it. With Maruki, it's like, in order to remove suffering, I'm going to make the choice that makes everybody feel good. And isn't that what we want? Isn't that? And you're tempted. Well, I don't know how much the player is tempted, right? At the end of the day, you as quote unquote Ren Amimiya don't really have a connection to like your own past. And so you're not really that tempted, particularly because you're like, man, these characters only became who they are as a response to engaging with both the trauma of things around them and their breaking of the mask. And so when you look at Haru with her father or things of that nature, you're like, I mean, I would want this for you, but it isn't real. And it also removes a lot of the things that you've made. And it's just seamless. It is very much of, all right, y'all didn't buy the God part, right? But what do you buy Maruki? Do you think that the suffering is so integral to these people? And why do we want them to have to suffer? That is a good question. And so I'm excited to see how royal content really ends up answering that question. And so it's a solid story. I wrestle with just how the characters have interacted with each other, and for a lot of the in-between game, how much I cared. And I think the one thing that this game knows is that more than anybody's story, this is a lot of Ryuji's story. And I think if the game really honed in on Ryuji for the... Because they hone in on Ryuji's getting to run again, but I also feel like if that was also able to connect to his actual family life, I think we might have gotten something where we as a player would have felt something. Because Persona 5 knows this game is about Ryuji. Why does the Morgana fight happen around Ryuji? I mean, there's a lot of things we can unpack with that, but I mean, it's an acknowledgement that Ryuji is pushing this game. Ryuji's whole thing about wanting to be popular is a key element. Ryuji is the one who's wronged by the adults around him in terms of how people perceive him. He's the one at the end who does the grand saving. In fact, you even get An at the end saying, "For real?" Like, the game acknowledges that. And so, in many ways, I was compelled to max out a social link. It feels like a game about defiance is about him. But at some time, I'm just like, I got over it. And I think that is where I am with the story. It's like, I liked it, but I got over it. And I'm wrestled with the fact that it's like the character who I think is most important to the story. And I love to see the end of the social link. I loved seeing him scout. I loved him trying to like have these connections, and you being an outcast with him gave him an outlet. But I guess Ryuji doesn't engage with the larger machinations of the plot, that his spirit fades. So even though this game tries to bring it back up with Morgana or bring it up at the end, I just feel like he's left hanging. And maybe I also feel that way because I sided with Morgana more than Ryuji in that fight. But I say that to say there's something missing in the story. And I think like I've gotten at how it betrays itself and so forth, but I think I wanted to bring up Ryuji as a spirit of the game and ask you as people who've played it, do you think they did enough with him? Because I think the game knows that he's so important. Also, I mean, he's his first party member, all of that. But bigger than that, the relation between him and adults is so profound that it doesn't really show up again in more meaningful places. Instead, you interrogate questions of popularity, questions of glory. And I think that makes sense, but I don't think it fits in the overall arc. Now let's get into the boss battles. I think they're boring. The Kanashiro boss battle is tiring. Same thing when you look at the same thing with Kamoshida. Like, a lot of, even the stuff with Wakaba, they're not great boss battles. And I don't think I can be convinced otherwise. And I think Persona 5 struggles with the fact that its mini bosses and boss battles are so similar, and that for a lot of boss battles, you're waiting on a moment to happen. And so you send off a player to go like shoot the bow, paint the thing in Madarame, or whatever that it is. They repeat this so many times, and it's just boring. Because what these things are elongated versions of the mini boss battles, because for most of them, everything with weakness exploitation doesn't work. And so you rely on the Kanda stuff, right? Like Matarakaja or things of that nature to boost up your attack, boost up your defense, and it works out. But as I say, those are the techniques you use with the mini bosses that are immune to your weaknesses. And so it feels like you're just watching or just like playing it for the long run. But no, there are two bosses I don't mention here. And they're the best bosses in the game because I feel like mechanically they take advantage of everything. Okumura and Madarame. I got stuck in these battles. But every time I look at these battles, I'm like, they're the best designed. It's not even close because they're built around the second part of the one more thing, which is the baton passes. The fact that you can baton to different people changes the ways in which you want to exploit weaknesses. And I think what, especially the Okumura coming back to that, was don't always use multi-targeting magic, because what you want to do is to boost up 4 times. And so it's better to use one to isolate one, chain with a different item to do that, chain, and then end with something like, once I saw that that's what the Akumura was pulling back from the Madarame fight and evolving it, I was like, oh, this is just design. These are fleshing out the mechanics in such a excellent way that everything else feels like a battle of attrition. Going back to that question about, like, is Persona 5 just a game of endurance? And I wrestle with that, because I think on one hand, one of the principles that Persona wants to do, and I think SMT does it, where it's like your battles just have to be perfect. Not even perfect, but you cannot exploit regular enemies the way you do bosses. And I think every JRPG struggles with that, specifically status effects and so forth. But I think what gets me with the other bosses is that they're long, right? Like the Okumura battle is 30 minutes. And so I struggle, and I'm running through my mind. I'm like, have I played any other turn-based game where the bosses are 30 minutes? And you're talking about sometimes minimum, right? Because let's not talk about that end boss battle with the god after you beat the Grail. I'm like, And again, maybe I'm playing wrong. I'm open to that in critique of me as a player, that I'm not executing the things correctly. But I really challenge you. Is like, think about how the game teaches you how to play, and whether or not these long attrition battles really do it. And I think what they're trying to do with these boss battles, right? Like, use Kanashiro as an example. They're trying to use the fact that, hey, we're highlighting him as a piggy bank guy, right? Like, these are great cognitive representations of who these people are. And yes, use your item to distract him. Do that, because that's the spirit of the character. But mechanically, it just gets... Man, that's a long battle. That's what I keep coming back to. Even something like Sei. I think Sei is a cool concept, right? The roulette wheel, the fake out with the roulette wheel, the exploitation of, like, there's something there. I'm open to someone telling me that, hey, but the Sei fight is really good though. But it's just, they're long, man. I guess I can't get over that. These are long battles that you feel it. And I guess maybe if there was a way for you not feel it, and I think I think what it is that in a game like this, where so many battles end so quickly because of how the one more plays out, or the baton passes, or even some of the other things that you have access to, it is very alarming when these boss battles take forever. And so those are just some thoughts. I think the one thing I want to highlight with A Tale of Endurance, again, because I mentioned the boss battles, are also the dungeon designs. They're visually engaging, but outside of the will seeds, no, the will seeds are brilliant. Those are really well embedded in their levels. I couldn't find them for some of that. Will seeds, if you're talking about the best parts of the Persona's dungeon design, they're all about how the will seeds are hidden and finding them. I will say, as a game, understanding that this is a tale of, hey, get to the next save room. If you get to the next save room, you have your exit point. You have all these things. I don't know how much I like seeing treasure in open spaces. Like, just really open spaces that you're going to... And I don't want to say other games don't have it, but in this game, it feels very egregious. And it makes me sometimes when I was like, like, is this good design? As I said, this is where I go back to. Do I think of these dungeon crawling approaches as better, as a different design experience? How does that make me feel about, like, finding items and things of that nature? I mean, all that shows up in Mementos is a whole big other issue. I won't even get into Mementos for this discussion. And so, I want to wrap with this. I went into Persona 5 with the expectation that this would be, like, the greatest JRPG experience I'd have. mainly because that's how people have talked about it. And I was interested in SMT3. I had a decent experience, but I got stuck there. And so this being an easier experience and all of those things coming together, this is a PS3 visual novel, and that's not a bad thing. But it makes me surprised at how much that got people so whipped up into a frenzy. Like I meditated on this game about like what could you cut from this, right? Because it's a long, arduous experience. As much as I've liked it, and I keep going back to like, this is a visual novel. Why did this win people over so greatly when I think we can identify some of the story issues, some of the boss issues, the things I've identified in this conversation? And I don't know. But I keep going back to the fact that it's like after, when it comes to dealing with, hey, traveling around, you're just going to go teleport to different places, which makes sense. I'm not mad. It's just one of those things where I'm like, why did you even give me this fake idea of an open world? Not because it's inherently bad. It's just, why would I ever do that if I can just go to different places? It made me wonder, right? Because I'm privy to certain conversations. I've heard people like, yeah, now Persona 3 Portable is a worse game because you don't get to explore the world. I'm like, what exploring of the world are you doing in Persona 5? That's so grand and important to the spirit of the game that it's inherently worse in Persona 3 Portable. I'll feel different maybe when I play that, but I said that to say is like, this is a visual novel. Go to place to place to place to place, and you teleport there, you do that, and that's not inherently bad. It's just, it makes me, I think what I keep asking myself is like, given the clear limitations of this game, given the clear some of the story stuff in this game, what has won people over? And I don't know. I think that's what I wrestle with this game. It's like, I don't really understand why it is such a beloved experience. And I think there are two things I'm going to go with. One, I think part of the answer is that it has a compelling opening, even beyond the Kamoshida arc. The story conceit of you being trapped in an interrogation room and that evolves through player choice, it is spectacular. It is one of the best conceits for a game concept, that when you get to that point and the game just flips on itself because of what you've done, it's elegant. It's genius. I really think that that does so much wonders for setting the stage of what this game is. Because it's always wonderful to see, like, oh, say his interrogation of you changes through the relationship. Like, it's just such, it's good. So I wonder if that's part of the answer. And I also have been wrestling with is like this conversation about timing and how much can you really cut from this game. So one of the other issues this game has is that it repeats itself, or it says itself a lot. I don't inherently mind that, but I noticed the reason why I'm saying like, why do people like this a lot is that I started checking out of certain conversations, or I started checking out of certain engagements. Specifically, I'll isolate the text messages. The text messages daily remind you what's going on. And for how I normally play JRPGs, that would be wonderful. So for those who don't know, if you play DQ11, when you leave it for a while, you come back into the game gives like a nice little mini synopsis. I think even Fire Red and Leaf Green used to do this. It's one of those things where it's like, especially playing long RPGs, it's such a great approach. And so this game doesn't do it that way. It does it through the text messages. And I think once you identify that that's what those text messages exist for, you respect them. But if you play this game in more of a marathon-y way, you just check out. And I think that's what I wrestle with. I could take years to finish a JRPG. I think I told people 9 took me like 5 years. And so for a game like that, the text message reminder of like Persona 5, because there's so many pieces going on for the story, would make sense and be effective. But if you're marathoning, or if I devoured this game in about a month and a half. Not normal TheWolvesDen approach to life and games. That's not what I normally do. And so the text messages would be such a great way to step back and it's like, okay, this is the main thing. This is the emotional stakes. Because think about it. It does so much of like emotional stakes where the choices people are making, and then just the small banter, right? Like, the banter is the least important part of those text messages. It does a good enough job, but it is just very much of a reframing of, hey, did you forget what happened? If you did, here it is. Ready? Cool. Now manage your time properly. And so when I hear people tell me, hey, you could cut the text messages, or you can cut, and I'm like, can you? Can you do any of these things? And it makes me wonder, for a game this long, right? I got exhausted. I'm like, I don't know where you cut. Because I've heard people try to tell me, hey, you could cut the Morgana Ryuji fight. No, you can't. That entire fight does so much for Morgana's character. So much. Like, it's not even funny. It's because it's Morgana up until that point is wrestling with the fact, hey, other people are coming in to replace her. I mean him. And so you can talk about that, but everything about the ending of once you find out who Morgana is tied to wrestling with the memories that are gone. That needs to come to the forefront. And I think the fact that you get such a big cast of people, that interrogation comes naturally. I just don't know if it should have been a Ryuji thing. I think it's that those two are just not fun, interactive people. Like, there's enough beef and stuff, but it didn't feel right. But I also, as I keep going back to, it's like, from a story perspective, does that even go anywhere? Can you really cut that part out going into the Kumara arc? I don't know if you can. You could cut the vacation. You can cut that. I think it's neat in terms of how that sets up the need for Okumura, but do you need that? You don't really need that. That's probably the only part of this game, because I'm like, I've heard people say, cut the Morgana Ryuji stuff, cut the text messages. I'm like, you can't do those. Those, as much as I think we have healthy critiques of those things, the game is built on those things, or relies on those things. So, I don't know. This all sounds negative, right? Like, I feel like my response about Persona 5 is not like the most glowing thing. But I devoured the game in about a month and a half. That should tell you that I enjoyed my time. And I want to play more of this series. I think part of what I think I'll do for future games is that I understand the loop and I understand the intentions of the dungeon design, but I will be way more receiving of some of the things that just were different about this game. And I'm curious, specifically, just how different cast members will play out, right? I think that I am open to the idea that future Personas handle their story and handle their characters in a little bit more of an elegant way all the way through. And because I kept on saying that, hey, I tapped out of the story at multiple times. Like, a perfect time is like in the Shiho stuff, I didn't really care to hear anything about Wakaba's relationship anymore to the plot of the story. And that's the emotional crux, right? Like, at some point in time, Wakaba and Futaba take over the concept of this. And so it doesn't look good when I'm doing the part 5, the mini bosses, and I'm like, wrap this up. And that just might be the case, like, this is a long game, right? And I marathoned it in a way that's unnatural to normally how I play games. All that to say, I think this is a well-designed game. I think it's elegant. I keep going back to that thing. Like, there's certain limitations, certain critiques where I'm like, what made this penetrate the culture so hard in light of these issues? And I'm aware, but I played the Royal version where certain things are easier to do. So I wonder how much of these issues are even exacerbated for those who played the 2017 release. So those are my Persona 5 thoughts. This is way longer than I planned. But I tried to go in deep, and I'm curious your thoughts. Let me know. And as we totally wrap up, I forgot to say this. Feel free to follow TheWolvesDen 25 on Instagram, Twitter, and Threads. Same thing for Menu Combat on Instagram, Twitter, and Threads. And then if you want Menu Combat content on TikTok, just go straight to TheWolvesDen 25. Appreciate you all, and don't forget to pause and customize your party.